So is the universe expanding? I think I'm justified in saying, I don't know. Why was it that we believed the universe was expanding in the first place? Well, not that the universe was expanding. Why did we believe, to start off, that the earth was the center of the universe to begin with? Philosophy, theology. To the Greeks, it only made sense if the gods created mankind on the earth, that mankind must have occupied a very special place within the universe, namely the center of the universe. It doesn't take a whole lot to figure out that logic there. It makes perfect sense that if the gods create us and we're important to them, that they would put us right where they can all see us. And as far as Christian theology is concerned, it makes sense to us as well because we believe we are made in God's image. So we very, very important people, very, very important creation. That God, it only makes sense that He would put us in the center of the universe. These are what I would call, metaphorically, the crystal sphere. These boundaries that we set up that prevent us from moving forward for our scientific discovery, but I would say also our theological discoveries. And when I say theological, by the way, I'm simply meaning our study and search for God. You can go ahead. There have been many crystal spheres that we've set up throughout history. I'm going to discuss a few of these so-called crystal spheres here, 3 of them in particular, in regards to what secular science, what sorts of crystal spheres they have set up historically, what sorts of false boundaries they have set up that have slowed down the progression of science as a result. You probably can't see the wording on this one, but the first word, DNA, and then underneath it are the words, the myth of junk DNA. You go ahead and flip the slide there. And again, sorry. The myth of junk DNA. What is junk DNA? I'm sure many of you here have heard of vestigial organs. What's a vestigial organ if you don't know what that is? A vestigial organ is an anatomical feature within your body or the body of another animal that supposedly serves no function. The reason that we say it's vestigial and it has no function is because the presupposition is that we have evolved into the creatures that we are today. Because we've evolved and we've gone through these progressive changes, there have been certain things that we do not need anymore in order to function at an optimal level. And so those structures remain inside of us, but they really don't do anything. A very common one that has been propagated throughout the years is the appendix. In fact, there's even been a time in history, and some places might still be doing this, where at birth, well, not necessarily at birth, but very close to birth, very early in life, that they would say, you know what? You don't need your appendix. All it does is when you grow up, it gets inflamed, it gets infected, you need it removed anyway, so let's just take it out shortly after the child is born. Well, that was a little bit of a mistake. They discovered that the appendix does have function, that it's not vestigial. It plays a role within the immune system, and your body really is better having it. Now you can function okay without it, but not as well as when you have it. So is it vestigial? No. And they've been finding this more and more in regards to vestigial organs, that they're really, as they look into it, they're running thin on their examples of vestigial organs within the textbooks. Even though they still use the appendix lots of times as one of them, it's inaccurate to call it a vestigial organ. So junk DNA. If you haven't inferred this already, it's more or less in the same sense what they believe to be a vestige of past evolutionary events. So it's not useful anymore. Protein, generally speaking, is used to code proteins. I'm not going to explain that process. I've tried it before, and it is very complicated. But think of DNA like a software program that tells the cell, to simplify it, how to manufacture proteins so they can function. Okay, and what sorts of proteins it needs to function. Well, 98% of DNA was found not to do this. Well, if only 2% of DNA is coding for proteins, 98% is not, and it doesn't look like it's not doing anything. It doesn't look like it's doing anything. Conclusion? It's vestigial. We don't need it. It's junk. Okay? Well, it turned out that junk is not an accurate term to describe junk DNA, even though I wish we would still keep the word junk DNA just to be able to kind of throw it in the face of the people who used to call it junk DNA, because I think it's glorious that we've discovered that this 98% of DNA is actually very functional, but not encoding proteins. I've listed in my book several of the examples of what exactly it does, and I believe one of the things is to synthesize RNA. Now, I'm not going to go into it's very funny. When I was researching DNA, I had to look up a lot of terms because it would lead me to big words, and then looking up the big word led to another big word, and looking up that big word led to another big word. So it was an ongoing struggle. So I'm not going to try to explain it because I have to explain a lot of vocabulary right now if I tried to do that. But just take it from me right now that there's the so-called junk DNA does a lot of very fascinating things that are just as important, if not more important, than the coding of proteins itself. Very, very fascinating. Next slide. Now, I call this an irrefutable proof of creation. Why on earth would I call this an irrefutable proof of creation? How can we look at junk DNA and say that God did it? Why would somebody who believes in God not expect to find junk DNA? Well, the Bible tells us that after God had created all things on planet Earth and in the universe, he looked at it and said that it is good. What does he mean it is good? I tossed this idea around in my head a little bit, and I ultimately, under one umbrella statement, said that ultimately what it is good means that it conforms to God's nature. That's a loaded statement right there in itself. What's conforming to God's nature? Well, I'll simplify it a little bit. Not by going into the nature of God per se, but into more of a generalization. I would say this composes of at least two parts. That every piece of creation has a purpose, and that every piece of creation fulfills its given purpose. So when God created the universe, everything had a purpose, and everything was actively fulfilling that given purpose. That is why we can say that his creation is good. Now, if you believe in God, you should not expect to find junk DNA, because that would say that something that God created is not fulfilling its given role. So why would God create junk from the get-go? He wouldn't. He would create something that's functional and it's going to fulfill its purpose. So that is one of our first crystal sphere right here, is that of junk DNA, which is not really junk, but is actually more accurately called non-coding proteins.